In the tumultuous year of 69 CE, the Roman Empire found itself on the edge of collapse. A fierce civil war, later known as the Year of the Four Emperors, had torn the empire apart. The struggle for power was fierce and unrelenting, with multiple claimants to the imperial throne vying for control. Amid this chaos, Vespasian, a general of renown, was hailed as emperor by his legions. Securing his place in history, his son Titus, who had already demonstrated his military prowess, was tasked with leading the campaign in Judea, a region embroiled in its own rebellion against Roman rule. The Jewish revolt against the Romans, which had erupted a few years earlier, had reached a critical juncture. The city of Jerusalem, a symbol of Judean resistance, had become the epicenter of the conflict. The rebels, despite their internal divisions, were fiercely determined to defend their city, even as the Roman forces closed in. The struggle in Judea was not just about military victory, but a battle for survival, culture, and identity. For the Romans, it was a matter of asserting their dominance and crushing the revolt once and for all. As Titus advanced towards Jerusalem, the situation for the Jewish defenders grew increasingly dire. The city, heavily fortified and filled with defenders who were divided but determined, faced the full might of the Roman army. The Zealots, the most militant faction among the Jews, had seized control of Jerusalem after a series of assassinations and power struggles within their ranks. Their leadership was fractured, and rival factions fought for dominance, even as the Romans pressed their siege. But this internal discord, while weakening the Jewish resistance, did not make their position any less perilous. Instead, it only served to exacerbate the suffering of those trapped inside the city. The Romans, under Titus's command, began their methodical approach to besieging Jerusalem. The city was surrounded, and the Romans, knowing they could not easily breach the city's formidable defenses, took to more strategic methods. They constructed walls and trenches around the city, cutting off all escape routes and leaving the defenders with no option but to fight or starve. The siege was not only a military tactic, but a psychological one, designed to break the spirit of the defenders and force them to surrender. As the Romans tightened their grip, food supplies within Jerusalem dwindled, and desperation began to set in. But even in the face of hunger and death, the defenders held firm, refusing to surrender. Meanwhile, as the siege continued, the internal strife among the Jewish factions worsened. The Zealots, led by John of Gischala, and the Sicarii, led by Simon Bar Giora, were initially reluctant allies. But with the Roman forces closing in, the two groups, although both fiercely opposed to Roman rule, could not reconcile their differences. Their bitter infighting made their position even more untenable. While the Romans encircled the city and began to slowly tear down the walls, the Jewish factions remained embroiled in their power struggles, making it even harder for them to mount a coordinated defense. As the months wore on, the situation within Jerusalem became increasingly grim. The Roman forces, having constructed siege ramparts and towers, relentlessly pressed forward, breaching the city's outer defenses. Titus, determined to crush the rebellion and send a clear message to the rest of the empire, ordered his forces to begin their final assault. With the city's supply lines cut off and internal divisions weakening the defenders, the Romans breached the walls and began their systematic destruction of Jerusalem. The once proud and holy city was reduced to rubble, its streets littered with the bodies of fallen defenders and civilians alike. The culmination of the Roman siege came with the destruction of the Second Temple, the holiest site in Judaism. On the 9th of Av, in 70 CE, the Romans set fire to the temple, reducing it to ashes. This was not merely a military conquest. It was a symbolic act, aimed at eradicating the very heart of Jewish identity and culture. The fall of the temple marked the end of the Jewish resistance in Jerusalem and was a devastating blow to the Jewish people. It was a defeat that would reverberate through history, shaping the fate of the Jewish diaspora for centuries to come. Yet, despite the overwhelming Roman victory, the revolt did not completely subside. Isolated pockets of resistance continued to exist in other parts of Judea, and the Roman legions would have to carry out additional campaigns to fully pacify the region. The fall of Jerusalem marked the end of the first phase of the Jewish revolt, but it was only the beginning of the Roman Empire's long and brutal relationship with the Jewish people. The rebellion had left its scars, both physical and psychological, on the Roman Empire and the Jewish people alike. The year of the 4 emperors had been a time of chaos and uncertainty for the Roman Empire, but it ultimately led to the rise of Vespasian and his son Titus, both of whom would go on to become emperors. Their military triumphs, particularly in Judea, solidified their power and established their legacy. For the Jews, however, the destruction of Jerusalem and the Second Temple represented the loss of their homeland, their heritage, and their place in history. It was a tragic and defining moment in Jewish history, one that would shape their future for centuries to come. The story of Jerusalem's fall in 70 CE cannot be fully understood without acknowledging the complex historical background that led to such devastation. One of the key turning points in this narrative was the reign of King Herod, who ruled over Judea from 37 BCE until his death in 4 BCE. Herod, often referred to as Herod the Great, was a king whose legacy was as monumental as it was controversial. A master builder and shrewd political figure, Herod was responsible for constructing some of the most iconic structures in the ancient world, including the expansion of the Second Temple in Jerusalem. This act alone would forever tie his name to the Jewish capital. However, beneath his architectural achievements lay a ruler notorious for his cruelty and ruthlessness. Herod's reign was characterized by paranoia and violence, eliminating potential rivals, including members of his own family, in order to secure his power. His reign, though marked by relative stability in terms of Roman control over Judea, sowed deep seeds of resentment among the Jewish people. Many viewed his rule as illegitimate, seeing him as a puppet of the Roman Empire, forced to carry out the will of the imperial authorities. This tension between the Jewish population and their foreign rulers would only grow after Herod's death. Upon his death in 4 BCE, the kingdom of Judea was divided among his sons, leading to a weakening of central power. The economic conditions began to deteriorate, with heavy taxation imposed by the Roman Empire to maintain control over the region. This created a strain on the Jewish population, many of whom were already struggling with poverty and social inequality. With the central authority weakening, Judea descended into political instability, and various factions began to vie for power. The most significant among them were the Zealots, a group determined to overthrow Roman rule through violent rebellion. As the years passed, the situation in Judea worsened. The Roman authorities, eager to maintain control over the province, instituted direct Roman governance over Judea in 6 CE, turning it into a Roman province. This shift further alienated the Jewish population, who saw this as the final confirmation of their loss of autonomy. The once semi-independent Jewish kingdom was now fully under Roman control, and tensions between the Romans and the Jewish people reached new heights. The imposition of Roman laws, including those that desecrated Jewish religious practices, intensified resentment. The transition to a Roman province marked the beginning of a more direct and oppressive form of Roman rule in Judea. Roman governors were placed in charge, and they were often indifferent or even hostile to Jewish religious practices and customs. The population, already exhausted from years of economic hardship and political strife, found their religious identity and way of life increasingly under threat. To the Jews, the Romans were not just foreign rulers, they were oppressors, imposing their laws and traditions on a people who had long maintained their distinct identity. This volatile mix of social unrest, economic hardship, and political instability set the stage for the outbreak of the Great Revolt in 66 CE. The revolt was not just a response to Roman military oppression. It was the culmination of decades of frustration and anger against foreign rule. The Jewish people, long accustomed to a degree of autonomy, now found themselves crushed under the weight of Roman occupation. The Great Revolt, which would ultimately lead to the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE, was the desperate cry of a people seeking to reclaim their independence and dignity. The revolt in 66 CE was a turning point for both the Romans and the Jews. The Roman Empire, which had long relied on maintaining peace and order through military might, found itself facing a determined and fiercely resistant population. For the Jewish people, the rebellion was an act of defiance against an empire that had stripped them of their sovereignty. However, despite the initial successes of the rebels, the superior might of the Roman legions, led by Titus, would prove overwhelming. The eventual fall of Jerusalem, the destruction of the Second Temple, and the subjugation of Judea marked the end of the Jewish resistance in the region, and signaled the beginning of a new era under Roman control. In the wake of Herod's death, the political and social structure of Judea deteriorated, setting the stage for the eventual revolt. The long-lasting effects of Herod's oppressive rule, combined with the deepening economic hardships and the transition to direct Roman governance, created an environment ripe for rebellion. The Great Revolt of 66 CE was not just about the Jewish people resisting foreign rule. It was about a people whose very identity and culture were being threatened by an empire that sought to erase their heritage. The destruction of Jerusalem was the tragic culmination of this conflict, but it was also the beginning of a new chapter in Jewish history, one marked by the loss of their homeland, but also the preservation of their spirit and identity across the diaspora. The transition of Judea into a Roman province and the growing discontent among the Jewish population eventually led to a series of revolts and uprisings. The oppressive actions of the Roman authorities, particularly the imposition of a census and the desecration of sacred Jewish sites, were key triggers that fueled the growing resentment and anger among the Jewish people. These actions, combined with the economic hardship and political instability that followed the death of King Herod, set the stage for a series of violent confrontations with Roman forces. The imposition of a Roman census in Judea in 6 CE was one of the most significant flashpoints that directly led to unrest. The census was not merely an administrative measure, but was perceived as a tool of Roman domination. For the Jewish people, it symbolized the complete loss of their autonomy, as they were forced to comply with a foreign tax system and Roman authority. The Jews had long been resistant to such acts of domination, and the census, which required all males to return to their ancestral homes for registration, was seen as a direct affront to their identity and religious practices. The backlash against the census was swift and fierce. A leader named Judas of Galilee emerged as one of the earliest and most significant figures in Jewish resistance. Judas, a Pharisee and an ardent nationalist, led a revolt against the census, rallying Jews to refuse to participate in the Roman registration process. His message was clear. No foreign ruler had the right to tax the Jewish people or impose their will upon them. This early revolt, though ultimately suppressed by Roman forces, became a symbol of resistance and set the tone for future rebellions. Judas's teachings laid the foundation for the Zealot movement, which would later play a major role in the Great Revolt of 66 CE. In addition to the census, the desecration of Jewish sacred sites by the Romans further escalated tensions. The Roman governors and their officials were often indifferent or openly hostile to Jewish customs and religious practices. Under Roman rule, Jewish holy sites were not always respected, and various instances of desecration fueled a sense of outrage. One of the most prominent examples was the installation of pagan idols and symbols. in the Jewish temple in Jerusalem, an act that directly violated the sanctity of the holiest site in Judaism. These acts were seen as deliberate attempts to humiliate the Jewish people and erase their religious identity. The desecration of sacred spaces and the suppression of Jewish religious practices contributed to the growing divide between the Jewish population and the Roman authorities. For many Jews, their faith was not only a matter of personal belief, but also a cornerstone of their national identity. The Romans, however, saw religion as a tool for maintaining control over their subjects, and they did not hesitate to impose their own customs and beliefs on the provinces they conquered. This clash of cultural and religious values created an environment ripe for revolt. The tensions that simmered under the surface for years came to a boiling point with the outbreak of the Great Revolt in 66 CE. The revolt was not just the result of one isolated action, but was the culmination of decades of frustration with Roman rule. The early uprisings, including Judas of Galilee's revolt, were key moments that galvanized the Jewish population and demonstrated their willingness to resist Roman authority. The Zealots, a group of militant Jews who had grown in influence, embraced the idea of armed rebellion as the only solution to Roman oppression. The revolt, which began as a small-scale uprising in response to specific Roman abuses, soon expanded into a full-scale conflict as the Jewish rebels sought to liberate their land from Roman control. The revolt gained momentum as more and more Jews joined the resistance. Led by a variety of factions, including the Zealots and other nationalist groups, the rebels sought to expel the Romans from Judea. They targeted Roman garrisons, public officials, and symbols of Roman authority. Though initially successful in several skirmishes, the Jews were up against one of the most powerful military forces in the ancient world, and their efforts would ultimately lead to the catastrophic siege of Jerusalem in 70 CE. The Great Revolt, and its tragic culmination with the destruction of the Second Temple, was rooted in these early acts of defiance against Roman rule. The refusal to participate in the census and the resistance to Roman religious impositions were not just isolated acts of protest. They represented a growing movement of resistance that would culminate in one of the most significant uprisings in Jewish history. The sacrifices made by the Jewish rebels during this time, as well as their unwavering determination to resist Roman rule, would echo throughout the centuries and become a defining moment in the history of the Jewish people. Ultimately, the revolt was crushed by the overwhelming might of the Roman Empire, but the legacy of resistance lived on. The Jewish people, despite the devastating loss of their homeland, continued to preserve their culture and faith in the face of adversity. The conflict that began with Judas of Galilee's early revolt was only the beginning of a larger struggle for Jewish independence, one that would shape the history of the region for centuries to come. The tension between the Jewish population and Roman authorities, which had been brewing for years, reached a boiling point with the actions of Gessius Florus, the Roman procurator of Judea. Florus, who held a significant role in overseeing the Roman interests in the province, played a pivotal role in triggering the escalation that would lead to the full-scale conflict known as the Great Revolt. His actions, particularly the seizure of funds from the Jerusalem temple, acted as the final spark that ignited the powder keg of discontent. The temple in Jerusalem was not just a religious center. It was the heart of Jewish identity and one of the largest sources of wealth and influence in Judea. The temple's treasury, which was filled with donations and offerings, had long been a symbol of Jewish autonomy and power. For the Roman authorities, the funds of the temple represented an important financial resource, and Gessius Florus saw an opportunity to exploit this wealth. In 66 CE, Florus seized a large portion of the temple's funds, using it to pay Roman debts and to further consolidate his control over the province. This blatant act of desecration not only violated Jewish religious law, but also sent a clear message that the Romans considered the sacred temple to be just another tool for their imperial interests. The seizure of the temple funds triggered immediate outrage among the Jewish population, especially in Jerusalem, which was home to many devout Jews. The public reaction was swift and violent, as riots broke out throughout the city. Florus, in a typical Roman response to rebellion, attempted to suppress the unrest with brute force. He ordered his soldiers to quell the riots with violence, resulting in the deaths of many Jews. This harsh crackdown only fueled the anger and resentment of the Jewish population, turning what might have been a localized protest into a full-scale revolt against Roman rule. As the conflict escalated, Jewish rebel factions began to organize and resist Roman control more systematically. These factions, consisting of various groups, including the Zealots and other nationalist movements, quickly seized key locations in and around Jerusalem. The Roman garrison stationed in the city, which had long been a symbol of Roman military presence and authority, was overwhelmed by the insurgents. The Jewish rebels, eager to seize this moment of opportunity, captured the Roman fortifications and weapons, including the Roman arms and military supplies. This victory marked a turning point in the rebellion, as it not only signaled the beginning of armed resistance, but also provided the rebels with much-needed resources to continue their struggle. The capture of the Roman garrison was a significant symbolic victory for the Jewish rebels. It demonstrated that the might of the Roman Empire could be challenged, and it rallied more Jews to the cause of rebellion. The Jews, who had long been oppressed under Roman rule, saw the success of the revolt as a sign that they might be able to reclaim their independence. The capture of the garrison also served as a rallying point for various factions within the Jewish community, many of whom had been divided in the past. The Zealots, for example, took a leading role in the resistance, advocating for the violent expulsion of the Romans from Judea, while other groups focused on more strategic long-term resistance. Despite these differences, the unity forged in the face of Roman oppression strengthened the resolve of the Jewish rebels. As tensions heightened, both sides braced for what seemed like an inevitable clash. The Roman Empire, with its vast military resources, was not going to allow the rebellion to succeed. The rebels, on the other hand, were committed to their cause, seeing this as their final chance to rid Judea of Roman rule and restore their national and religious independence. The conflict that had begun with the seizure of temple funds and the subsequent riots in Jerusalem now morphed into a full-scale war. The Roman Empire's response was swift and merciless. Roman legions were dispatched to suppress the rebellion, leading to the brutal siege of Jerusalem in 70 CE. The siege of Jerusalem, as it came to be known, would become one of the most devastating chapters in Jewish history. Despite initial successes, the Jewish rebels found themselves locked in a deadly struggle against a far superior military force. The Romans, under the leadership of Titus, laid siege to the city, surrounding it with a massive force and cutting off all supplies. The Jewish defenders, initially filled with hope and resolve, soon realized that they were up against an insurmountable force. The Romans, using advanced siege tactics and overwhelming firepower, eventually breached the city's walls, leading to the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the Second Temple. The escalation of the conflict from a local riot to a full-scale rebellion, fueled by the actions of Gessius Florus and the capture of key Roman positions, set the stage for the destruction of Jerusalem. The rebellion, though ultimately crushed by the Romans, was a powerful testament to the determination and resistance of the Jewish people in the face of Roman oppression. The seeds of the revolt, planted by decades of Roman mistreatment and a series of provocative actions, culminated in a violent and tragic climax. While the Romans may have won the battle, the spirit of Jewish resistance would endure for generations, leaving a lasting legacy in the history of Judea and its people. As the revolt in Judea spread and intensified, the Roman Empire's response was swift and forceful. The rebellion, ignited by the desecration of the Jerusalem temple and compounded by years of growing unrest under Roman rule, now demanded the full might of the Roman military. To suppress the uprising Emperor Nero dispatched his most capable generals, Vespasian and his son Titus, to Judea, tasked with quelling the rebellion and reasserting Roman dominance over the region. The ensuing military campaigns would bring a devastating wave of Roman force, leading to the eventual fall of Jerusalem. Vespasian, who had already been making strategic advances through the provinces, was appointed to lead the Roman forces in Judea. He quickly set about systematically retaking key locations that had fallen into rebel hands. The Roman legions, well-equipped and battle-hardened, began recapturing cities and towns across Judea, forcing the Jewish resistance to retreat and regroup. Vespasian's approach was methodical, using the Roman military's superior tactics and technology to systematically defeat the rebels in the field. The Romans marched from one victory to another, each conquest tightening their grip on the region. However, despite the relentless Roman advance, the Jewish rebels remained fiercely resistant. Even as their positions grew increasingly untenable, they continued to fight, determined to hold onto their territory. Jerusalem, the symbolic and strategic heart of the rebellion, became the focal point of the conflict. As the Romans closed in, it became clear that the battle for the city would determine the outcome of the entire revolt. In 69 CE, Vespasian's forces began the encirclement of Jerusalem, cutting off supplies and weakening the city's defenses. Meanwhile, Titus, Vespasian's son, was appointed to oversee the final stages of the siege. The Roman military, now determined to crush the Jewish resistance once and for all, built massive siege walls around Jerusalem, preventing any chance of escape. What followed was a brutal and protracted siege that would stretch for months as the Jewish defenders inside the city fought to the last man. The situation grew dire for the besieged Jews as food supplies dwindled and starvation set in. At the same time, the internal divisions among the Jewish factions in Jerusalem began to exacerbate the problem. The Jewish resistance was not united. Internal factionalism was rampant, with various groups vying for control of the city and its defense. The Zealots, one of the most radical factions, were in control of the temple and much of the city, but they were opposed by the more moderate factions, including the followers of John of Giscala and Simon Bar Giora. These groups, despite sharing a common enemy in Rome, were bitterly divided, each striving for dominance within the rebellion. The result was a brutal civil war inside the city, which severely weakened their ability to resist the Roman forces. Instead of focusing all their energy on fighting the Romans, the Jewish factions were more concerned with their own infighting. Supplies that could have been used to sustain the city's defenses were instead destroyed by the various factions to gain an advantage over one another. This infighting drained their morale, and many of the defenders were demoralized by the lack of unity and the constant fighting among themselves. The Roman military response, though initially delayed by the Jewish rebels' fierce resistance, became more effective as Vespasian and Titus capitalized on this internal disarray. The Romans, skilled in siege warfare, gradually broke through the city's outer defenses, slowly making their way deeper into Jerusalem. By the time the Romans finally breached the city walls, much of the Jewish resistance had been decimated not only by Roman soldiers, but also by their internal divisions. The collapse of Jerusalem was, in many ways, as much a result of Jewish civil war as it was the Roman military might. The fall of Jerusalem in 70 CE marked the tragic conclusion of the rebellion. The city was systematically destroyed, with the temple central to Jewish identity razed to the ground. The Romans, under Titus, looted the temple of its sacred treasures, including the golden menorah and other artifacts, which were paraded through the streets of Rome as symbols of their victory. The victory, however, came at a tremendous cost. Rome had lost thousands of soldiers in the protracted conflict, and many of the Jewish rebels and civilians had been killed or enslaved. Internally, the Jewish factions were left shattered, and the city lay in ruins. The failure to unite against the common Roman enemy had ensured their downfall. In the aftermath of the fall of Jerusalem, the Jewish people were left scattered and broken, their hopes of independence crushed for the time being. The civil war within Jerusalem, fueled by factionalism and internal strife, had proved as costly as the Roman siege itself, and it would take centuries for the Jewish people to fully recover from the devastation wrought by both the Romans and their own divisions. The fall of Jerusalem and the suppression of the rebellion were not just military victories for Rome, they were also a testament to the devastating impact of internal division. The Jewish resistance, while fierce and determined, was ultimately unable to overcome the threat of Roman military power. However, the lessons of these events would live on, shaping the course of Jewish history for generations to come. Despite the defeat, the spirit of resistance remained alive, setting the stage for future challenges to Roman rule. The year of the four emperors in 69 CE was a defining moment in Roman history, marked by political instability and power struggles following the death of Emperor Nero. The civil conflict that ensued saw four men vie for the imperial throne, but it was Vespasian, a seasoned general, who emerged victorious, solidifying his claim to the empire. Upon securing his position as emperor, Vespasian entrusted his son Titus with the military campaign in Judea, where the great Jewish revolt was in full swing. At the time, Judea had been engulfed in rebellion against Roman rule for several years, ever since tensions had escalated with the Roman taxation system, religious desecration, and the imposition of a census. As the Roman Empire focused on consolidating its internal power, Titus, now a commanding figure, inherited a volatile situation in Judea. Though the region had experienced multiple revolts before, this uprising had grown far larger and more organized than any prior conflict. The Jewish rebels, although deeply divided among various factions, were unified in their resistance to the Roman presence. Titus, understanding the importance of decisively quelling the revolt, advanced towards Jerusalem. His approach to the city was deliberate, and he began by isolating Jerusalem, preventing any potential reinforcements or escapes. The Roman strategy was a gradual encirclement, classic Roman military precision at play, aimed at draining the city's resources and leaving the defenders with few options but to surrender or die fighting. But the Jewish resistance was not one to capitulate easily. Despite internal factionalism that plagued the rebels' unity, the Jewish forces, led by radical groups like the Zealots, fiercely defended the city's walls. The conflict that followed would become one of the most brutal and significant sieges in ancient history. Inside Jerusalem, the rebellion had degenerated into a civil war between rival Jewish factions. The most powerful group, the Zealots, commanded the temple and other strongholds within the city. Yet their internal feuds with moderate groups, such as the followers of John of Giscala and Simon Bar Giora, only served to weaken their collective resistance against the Romans. This infighting undermined their military strength and hampered any chance of uniting the city's defense. While the factions were occupied with their own struggles for power, the Romans systematically tightened their grip on Jerusalem. Titus's forces, although delayed by the disunity within the rebels, soon made substantial headway. The Romans built siege ramps, siege walls, and fortified camps surrounding Jerusalem. The situation within the city became dire as food supplies dwindled and starvation set in, exacerbated by the destruction of food stores by the rebels in a desperate attempt to prevent their capture. What was once a thriving, bustling metropolis now became a city besieged by starvation, disease, and the constant threat of Roman assault. With each passing day, the Roman military closed in tighter. The Jewish factions, though formidable in their resistance, were no match for the superior Roman forces, who not only had greater numbers, but more advanced military technology and tactics. Titus's men breached the first and second walls of the city, and by mid-70 CE, the fall of Jerusalem seemed inevitable. Despite the zeal and determination of the Jewish fighters, the internal divisions among their ranks prevented them from mounting a unified defense. The Zealots, who had once held the temple and controlled the city's fortifications, began to lose ground to the advancing Roman legions. The final assault on the city, which began in earnest in late summer of 70 CE, was a savage and unrelenting Roman effort to break the remaining Jewish resistance. The temple, a symbol of Jewish identity and resistance, was set on fire. Its sacred treasures plundered and paraded through Rome as symbols of Roman supremacy. The city itself was reduced to rubble. The destruction was systematic, with entire districts and fortifications destroyed to ensure that nothing could stand against Roman power. By the time the Romans had fully breached the city and subdued the last of the Jewish holdouts, the scope of the destruction was unimaginable. The walls of Jerusalem, once considered impenetrable, now lay in ruins, and thousands of Jewish men, women, and children were killed or taken captive, while many others were sold into slavery. The Roman victory, led by Titus, brought a decisive end to the Jewish revolt, but left the region in ruins, with the scars of war etched into its very fabric. The fall of Jerusalem in 70 CE and the subsequent Roman victory were pivotal moments in the history of both Rome and the Jewish people. The rebellion's failure to unite against a common enemy, the Romans, ultimately sealed its fate. Titus's victory was celebrated back in Rome, where he paraded through the streets in triumph, and his role in the destruction of Jerusalem would be immortalized in monuments like the Arch of Titus. However, the conquest of Jerusalem came at a high price, with the rebellion's brutal suppression leading to the widespread scattering of the Jewish people and the eventual transformation of the region into the Roman province of Judea. Despite the devastation, the Jewish spirit of resistance lived on, and the events of the revolt would have far-reaching consequences, influencing Jewish and Roman history for centuries to come. As the Romans closed in on Jerusalem, the situation within the city grew increasingly dire. Titus, having assumed command of the Roman forces in Judea, adopted a methodical and calculated approach to the siege, understanding the importance of not only defeating the Jewish resistance, but also demonstrating Roman military superiority. The Roman forces encircled Jerusalem with impressive precision, constructing a deep trench and a massive wall around the city, effectively trapping the defenders inside. This siege tactic, designed to prevent escape or outside assistance, set the stage for one of the most brutal chapters in the history of warfare. The construction of the trench and the wall, which were high and difficult to breach, created an unbreakable barrier between the inhabitants of Jerusalem and the outside world. The city was now completely surrounded, and the Romans initiated a campaign of psychological warfare, systematically cutting off all supplies to the city. At first, this tactic was slow, but it gradually began to take its toll. Food and water shortages became rampant, and the once thriving Jerusalem started to resemble a city on the brink of collapse. The Jewish rebels, who had fought so fiercely to maintain their resistance against Rome, found themselves slowly starving and dying in the face of an encroaching Roman military machine. However, the Romans were not only waging a war of attrition. Inside Jerusalem, the Jewish factions, which had long been divided by internal strife, became further entrenched in their conflicts. The Zealots, the most radical and militant of the Jewish groups, held control over much of the city, including the temple. Their leader, John of Giscala, fought against Simon Bar Kokhba, another powerful rebel leader, in a battle for dominance. Despite their shared goal of resisting Roman rule, their infighting sapped their strength and divided their resources. The factions frequently clashed, further weakening the city's ability to defend itself against the Romans. The Zealots' decision to burn food supplies in an effort to prevent them from falling into Roman hands only exacerbated the famine, leaving the inhabitants of Jerusalem with little more than the barest means to survive. As the siege dragged on for 7 long months, the Romans pressed forward, continually battering Jerusalem's defenses. Titus, determined to finish what had begun, ordered his men to build siege ramps and towers, methods designed to breach the city's formidable walls. As the Roman siege machines slowly pushed against the city's fortifications, the desperation within Jerusalem grew. The Jewish defenders, despite their bravery, were overwhelmed by the sheer scale and strength of the Roman army. The citizens of Jerusalem, once proud of their heritage and their city, were now starving, fighting among themselves and watching as their homes were destroyed by the Roman onslaught. In the summer of 70 CE, after months of grueling warfare, the Roman forces broke through the final layers of Jerusalem's defenses. It was a brutal and decisive moment in the siege. The Romans surged through the city, and the final battle for Jerusalem began. The temple, the sacred heart of Jewish identity and resistance, became the focal point of the Roman assault. Despite the valiant efforts of the Zealots and other defenders, the Romans set fire to the Second Temple. The flames consumed the once great structure, leaving nothing but ashes and ruin in its wake. For the Jewish people, the loss of the temple was a devastating blow, symbolizing the destruction of their national and religious identity. As the Romans rampaged through the city, they continued to kill, enslave, or capture any remaining defenders and civilians. The city of Jerusalem, which had stood as a beacon of Jewish heritage and resistance, was systematically demolished. The once great walls, fortifications, and buildings that had made the city a thriving center of culture, religion, and commerce were reduced to rubble. By the time the Romans had completed their assault, Jerusalem had been obliterated, and its people had either been killed or dispersed across the Roman Empire as slaves. The fall of Jerusalem in 70 CE marked the definitive end of the Great Jewish Revolt. The city was left in ruins, and the Jewish people, for the most part, were scattered across the Roman Empire. The loss of Jerusalem and the destruction of the Second Temple were monumental events that reshaped the course of Jewish history. The Romans celebrated their victory with a grand triumph in Rome, immortalized by the Arch of Titus, which depicted the looting of the temple and the triumph of the Roman Empire over the Jewish rebels. For the Jews, however, the destruction of Jerusalem was not the end of their struggle. Despite the devastation, Jewish resistance continued in pockets across the region, and the spirit of rebellion against Roman rule lingered. Yet the fall of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple, and the brutal suppression of the revolt solidified Roman control over Judea and marked a decisive turning point in the relationship between the Jewish people and the Roman Empire. The consequences of the siege and the loss of Jerusalem would echo through history, influencing the future of both the Jewish diaspora and the Roman Empire for centuries to come. The aftermath of Jerusalem's fall in 70 CE left an indelible mark on the Jewish people and the region itself. The devastation wrought by the Romans was not limited to the physical destruction of the city, but extended to the social and political fabric of Judea. As the smoke of the burning temple cleared and the streets of Jerusalem lay littered with the dead, the surviving inhabitants faced a grim future. The once proud capital of Jewish identity had been reduced to ruins, and the rebellion that had gripped the region for years had been crushed, though not without immense cost to the Roman Empire. Prominent Jewish rebel leaders, such as John of Giscala and Simon Bar Giora, were captured by the Romans in the aftermath of the siege. John, who had led the zealot forces within Jerusalem, was taken alive and brought to Rome in chains. His fate was grim, though he was spared execution. Instead, John was imprisoned for life, a humiliating end for a man who had once been one of the most powerful figures in Judea. His capture symbolized the defeat of the Zealot faction and the end of any meaningful organized resistance within Jerusalem. Simon Bar Kokhba, another key rebel leader, did not share the same fate. Unlike John, Simon was not spared by the Romans. After his capture, he was brought before the Roman authorities and was executed, his life coming to a brutal end in the shadow of the Roman triumph. Simon's execution marked the final end of the Jewish leadership in the revolt, and the symbolic death of any hope of regaining independence in the near future. For the Romans, the executions of these leaders were not just punitive measures, but also public demonstrations of their complete victory over the Jewish insurgents. The physical destruction of Jerusalem was immense. The Romans systematically dismantled the city, tearing down its fortifications, temples, and other significant buildings. The once magnificent Second Temple, the heart of Jewish worship and national identity, was razed to the ground. The Romans, after looting the temple of its treasures, set it on fire, reducing it to a heap of ash and stone. This loss would be felt deeply by the Jewish people for centuries, as the temple had been a symbol not just of religious devotion, but of their national identity and their connection to their land. The destruction of the temple and the city that had housed it symbolized the total collapse of Jewish political autonomy in Judea. In the wake of the destruction, the survivors of the siege found themselves facing a new and harsh reality. Many of the city's inhabitants were either killed in battle or executed by the Romans, while others were captured and sold into slavery. The survivors, stripped of their homes, their land, and their dignity, were scattered across the Roman Empire. Thousands were sent to work in Roman mines, some were forced into labor on construction projects, and many others were sold to the highest bidder as slaves. The once thriving Jewish community in Jerusalem had been decimated, and the people were now dispersed across the far reaches of the Roman world. The fall of Jerusalem marked the formal end of the Great Jewish Revolt, but it did not signify the complete eradication of Jewish resistance. Although the city had fallen, pockets of Jewish rebels continued to fight in other parts of Judea. One of the most significant remaining strongholds was Masada, a mountaintop fortress where a group of Jewish rebels, led by Eleazar ben Yair, continued to resist Roman forces. For several years after the fall of Jerusalem, Masada remained a symbol of Jewish defiance against Roman rule. It was not until 73 CE, 3 years after the fall of Jerusalem, that the Romans finally breached the fortress, marking the end of the revolt. However, by this point, the loss of Jerusalem and the destruction of the Second Temple had already broken the backbone of the Jewish resistance. The end of the revolt and the fall of Jerusalem had profound consequences for the Jewish people. In the aftermath of their crushing defeat, the Romans imposed harsh measures to prevent any further rebellion. The Jewish people were systematically stripped of their land and their political autonomy. The Roman authorities renamed the province of Judea to Syria Palestina in an attempt to erase the memory of Judea from history, a move designed to undermine Jewish identity and to prevent any future rebellions. Jews were prohibited from entering Jerusalem except for one day each year, the day of Tisha B'Av, to mourn the destruction of the temple. This was a cruel reminder that the Jewish people had been expelled from their own city, their holy land, and their sacred place of worship. Despite the terrible toll of the revolt, the Jewish people did not disappear. The destruction of Jerusalem, while devastating, did not mark the end of Jewish life in the Roman world. The Jewish diaspora spread far and wide, and Jewish communities continued to thrive in places like Alexandria, Rome, and Babylon. However, the loss of their homeland and the destruction of the temple would remain a deep and painful wound for the Jewish people, one that would shape their identity and their faith for generations to come. The fall of Jerusalem in 70 CE had brought an official end to the Great Jewish Revolt. yet remnants of resistance lingered in the heart of Judea. The Romans, though victorious, had not fully crushed every spark of rebellion. In the remote desert stronghold of Masada, Jewish rebels, emboldened by their fight for independence, continued their resistance against Roman rule. For 3 more years, Masada, perched high atop a steep mountain plateau near the Dead Sea, had become a symbol of defiance, a fortress that represented the very spirit of the Jewish revolt. But as the Romans moved to secure the entire region, they turned their full attention to the last pockets of resistance. The siege of Masada would prove to be the final chapter in the rebellion, a tragic and symbolic end to the Jewish struggle for freedom. Masada's defenders, a group of around 960 Jewish rebels, were led by Eleazar ben Yair. These men and women were mostly zealots and sicarii, passionate fighters who had refused to surrender to the Romans after the fall of Jerusalem. They retreated to Masada, an ancient fortification that Herod the Great had built as a royal palace, and turned it into a last stronghold of resistance. The location was nearly impregnable, surrounded by steep cliffs on all sides, with only a single narrow path leading up to the mountain top. The rebels believed they could withstand a Roman siege indefinitely. And for a time, they did. They survived on stored provisions and water, relying on their knowledge of the terrain and their fierce determination to hold out against the might of the Roman Empire. The Romans, however, were relentless. Led by the Roman general Flavius Silva, the Roman forces built an elaborate siege infrastructure around Masada. They constructed a massive siege ramp, a project that took months to complete, and began to close in on the fortifications. As the Romans advanced, the rebels inside Masada faced an increasingly dire situation. The siege ramp was completed, and the Romans prepared for their final assault. The defenders, knowing that they could not hold out much longer against the Roman might, faced the grim reality of what would come if they were captured. They had heard of the horrors that had befallen their people, the mass executions, the enslavement, and the destruction of Jerusalem. In their eyes, surrender was not an option. In a final act of defiance, the rebels decided to end their lives rather than submit to Roman capture. On the eve of the Roman assault, Eleazar ben Yair, the leader of the resistance, addressed the defenders, urging them to choose death over slavery. They decided to die as free people, refusing to live under the rule of their oppressors. In a tragic and dramatic scene, the rebels took their own lives one by one, in an organized manner. They killed their families first, then themselves, with the last man standing committing suicide after having set the fortress ablaze to prevent the Romans from profiting from the defenders' demise. When the Romans finally breached the walls of Masada, they were met with a chilling sight. The bodies of the defenders scattered across the fortress, a silent testament to their courage and resolve. Only 7 survivors, women and children, were found hidden in the remains of the fort. These survivors were spared by the Romans and became the sole witnesses to the massacre that had taken place within the stronghold. The fall of Masada marked the symbolic end of the Jewish revolt against Roman rule. Though the revolt had officially ended with the fall of Jerusalem, the siege and mass suicide at Masada embodied the unyielding spirit of resistance that had characterized the Jewish struggle. Masada became a powerful symbol in Jewish history, representing both the determination to fight for freedom and the tragic consequences of that resistance. For centuries, the story of Masada has been passed down through generations, a reminder of the courage and sacrifice of those who chose death over dishonor. The defeat at Masada also marked the definitive end of organized Jewish resistance in Judea. The Roman Empire had secured its hold on the region, and the Jewish people were left to rebuild their lives in the aftermath of the revolt. The destruction of the Second Temple and the fall of Jerusalem were deeply felt by Jews across the world, but Masada's final stand left an indelible mark on their collective memory. It symbolized the ultimate cost of defiance and became a rallying cry for future generations. Even though the Jewish people had been scattered and oppressed, the spirit of Masada continued to inspire resilience and hope in the face of adversity. The destruction of Jerusalem and the fall of Masada were not just the end of physical resistance. They were also the beginning of a long and painful transformation for the Jewish people and the region of Judea. Following the suppression of the Great Jewish Revolt, Rome's dominance in Judea became undeniable, and the aftermath of the conflict had profound and long-lasting consequences for both the Roman Empire and the Jewish people. The demographic toll was staggering, with over 90% of Jerusalem's population either killed in battle, starved to death, or taken as slaves by the Romans. The city, once a thriving cultural and religious hub, lay in ruins, its streets empty, its temples desecrated, and its walls broken. The surviving Jewish population was scattered throughout the empire, and their homeland was reduced to a mere shadow of what it had been. For the Romans, this victory solidified their control over Judea and the wider region. The imperial grip was unyielding, with Roman officials like procurators and legates maintaining a firm presence in the area. In addition to the physical destruction of cities, the Romans also initiated policies aimed at erasing Jewish ties to their homeland. Jerusalem was renamed Aelia Capitolina, a Roman city built upon the ashes of the old Jewish capital, and the province of Judea was renamed Syria Palestina. This was not just a change of name, it was an attempt to sever the historical and cultural connection between the Jewish people and their ancestral land. The name Palestina itself was chosen as a means of further erasing the identity of the Jewish people. Deriving from Philistia, the ancient enemies of the Israelites, Roman religious policies also sought to crush Jewish traditions, as Hadrian, the Roman emperor, imposed prohibitions against circumcision, banned the practice of Judaism, and even executed Jewish scholars. The sacred scrolls of the Torah were burned, and temples to Roman gods were constructed in Jerusalem, including a massive temple to Jupiter on the Temple Mount. Yet, despite the overwhelming force and the efforts to erase Jewish culture, the spirit of resistance was far from extinguished. The legacy of Masada, where the rebels chose death over subjugation, became an enduring symbol of Jewish defiance. However, the true extent of Jewish suffering in the aftermath of the revolt would only grow in the years that followed. Those who survived the violence of the rebellion and the siege were either sold into slavery or dispersed across the Roman Empire. Many were forced to work in mines, on construction projects, or in agricultural fields, far from their homes in Judea. Entire communities were uprooted, their members sold and scattered, contributing to the formation of the Jewish diaspora across the empire. While some Jewish communities had already existed in places like Alexandria, Rome, and Babylon, the mass displacement following the revolt accelerated the spread of Jewish culture, language, and religion throughout the Mediterranean world. This widespread dispersal did not lead to a cessation of conflict, however. The Jewish desire for independence and self-determination did not fade easily. The Roman Empire, despite its military might, could not fully extinguish the fires of rebellion. The Bar Kokhba Revolt, which erupted in 132 CE, was the next significant challenge to Roman rule in Judea. Led by Simon Bar Kokhba, a charismatic and fierce leader, the revolt was fueled by the Roman Emperor Hadrian's oppressive policies, particularly his decision to rebuild Jerusalem as a Roman colony and his religious restrictions. Bar Kokhba, believed by some to be the Jewish Messiah, managed to rally a large following and initially dealt significant blows to the Roman forces, even temporarily capturing parts of Judea and establishing an independent Jewish state. However, as with the earlier revolt, the Romans responded with overwhelming force. General Julius Severus was sent to suppress the uprising, bringing with him tens of thousands of Roman soldiers. The Bar Kokhba Revolt, like the Great Jewish Revolt before it, was marked by fierce resistance, but ultimately ended in defeat. The Romans crushed the rebellion after 3 years of brutal fighting, and its aftermath was even more devastating than the first revolt. The Roman forces systematically destroyed villages, executed thousands of rebels, and enslaved many of the survivors. Bar Kokhba himself was killed, and his followers were either slain or forced into exile. The rebellion's failure marked the definitive end of organized Jewish resistance against Roman rule in Judea. In the aftermath, Hadrian enacted even harsher measures, including the complete banishment of Jews from Jerusalem. Jews were prohibited from entering the city except for 1 day each year. On Tisha B'Av, the day of mourning for the destruction of the first and second temples, the long-term impact of the Roman suppression of the Jewish revolts was profound. Roman control over Judea remained intact, and the Jewish people, while maintaining their identity and traditions, found themselves scattered across the empire. Over the centuries, the memory of the revolts, especially the tragic fall of Masada and the failure of Bar Kokhba's rebellion, became integral to Jewish identity. The resilience of the Jewish people, despite their defeat, became a symbol of endurance, and the longing for return to the land of Israel persisted, remaining a central theme in Jewish culture and religious practice. While the Roman Empire sought to erase the Jewish connection to Judea, the spirit of the Jewish people remained unbroken, and their eventual return to their homeland would not come until many centuries later. In the 20th century, the Roman Empire, under Emperor Trajan, reached its greatest territorial extent, stretching from the British Isles to the Persian Gulf, and the conquest of Parthia in the east was a crucial part of his imperial ambitions. The Parthian Empire, a powerful and ancient civilization, had long been a rival to Rome, and Trajan's military campaign in 113 CE sought to subjugate this eastern power and secure Roman dominance over the region. Trajan's campaign began with great success as he crossed the Euphrates River and conquered key Parthian cities, including the capital, Ctesiphon. This victory symbolized not only a significant military achievement, but also solidified Trajan's reputation as one of Rome's greatest emperors. A pivotal moment in Trajan's Parthian campaign was his decision to install a puppet ruler on the throne of Parthia. Trajan crowned Parthamasp, a leader who had previously been allied with Rome, as the new king of the Parthians. This strategic move aimed to consolidate Roman control over the region by ensuring that the Parthian throne would be aligned with Roman interests. Parthamasp's coronation was not just a ceremonial gesture, it was a statement of Roman authority over the eastern territories. The ceremony itself, as described by the historian Cassius Dio, portrayed Trajan as a powerful emperor who could not only defeat his enemies, but also shape the political landscape of the conquered regions. However, Trajan's successes in the east were overshadowed by his deteriorating health. The grueling conditions of military campaigning in the scorching desert heat of Mesopotamia took a significant toll on the aging emperor. Despite his military triumphs, Trajan's body could not withstand the strain of constant warfare, and his health began to decline rapidly. It was a poignant moment in Roman history, as the empire, which had been under the rule of one of its most capable and ambitious emperors, faced the prospect of leadership change. In 117 CE, while returning to Rome from the Parthian front, Trajan's condition worsened, and he died in the city of Selinus in Cilicia. His death marked the end of a chapter in Roman history, and the empire faced a new era under the rule of his successor, Hadrian. Trajan's death was a turning point for the Roman Empire, as it shifted from an era of aggressive expansion to one of consolidation and stabilization. Hadrian, who had served as Trajan's trusted lieutenant, assumed the throne and quickly began to reverse some of his predecessor's policies, particularly those related to military campaigns and territorial expansion. Hadrian's approach to governance was markedly different from Trajan's. While Trajan had been an expansionist emperor, seeking to extend Rome's borders to their furthest limits, Hadrian took a more cautious approach. He decided to consolidate and secure the empire's existing borders rather than continuing to push for new conquests. One of Hadrian's most famous actions was the abandonment of many of Trajan's eastern conquests, including Mesopotamia. The decision to relinquish control over these territories was controversial, but Hadrian recognized the financial and military strain that maintaining such far-reaching territories would place on the empire. In doing so, Hadrian effectively put an end to the costly Parthian campaign and shifted Roman focus back to defending and strengthening the empire's core provinces. Hadrian's decision to abandon the eastern territories, including Mesopotamia, was also influenced by the desire to focus on the empire's western and northern borders, which were increasingly under threat from Germanic and Celtic tribes. Hadrian's military reforms, such as the construction of Hadrian's Wall in Britain, emphasized the need to protect the empire from external threats rather than extending its borders further. This shift in strategy reflected a broader change in Roman imperial policy, moving away from the aggressive expansionism of Trajan to a more defensive and strategic stance under Hadrian. The end of Trajan's Parthian campaign and the transition to Hadrian's reign represented a significant moment in Roman history. Trajan had envisioned an empire at its zenith, with Roman power extending over vast territories in the east. However, Hadrian's pragmatic leadership ensured that the empire remained stable and secure, even if it meant relinquishing some of the hard-won territories. While Trajan's legacy would forever be tied to his military conquests, it was Hadrian's policies of consolidation and fortification that ultimately allowed the Roman Empire to endure for centuries to come. Trajan's Parthian campaign, though short-lived, demonstrated the power of Roman military might, but it also highlighted the limits of empire building in the face of internal and external pressures. Hadrian's reign, marked by careful diplomacy and strategic defense, would prove to be a defining era in the history of Rome. As Hadrian took control of the Roman Empire in 117 CE, following the death of his predecessor Trajan, the shifting focus of the empire began to have significant consequences for the provinces, particularly in the eastern territories. One of the most contentious regions during this time was Judea, where the tensions between the Roman Empire and its Jewish population had already led to uprisings under both Trajan and his successors. While Trajan had initially focused on expanding Rome's borders, Hadrian's reign took a different direction, prioritizing stabilization and consolidation. Despite this shift, the volatile situation in Judea remained a major concern for the new emperor. The Jewish resistance in Judea did not dissipate with the death of Trajan, and the region remained a hotbed of insurrection. Led by prominent figures like Julian and Pappus, the Jewish rebels continued to oppose Roman rule in increasingly violent ways. Julian and Pappus were leaders of the revolt who commanded considerable support among the Jewish population, particularly from those who resented Roman occupation and the imposition of foreign rule on their sacred lands. Under the leadership of these figures, the Jewish rebellion escalated, further straining the fragile relationship between Rome and the province. The Roman general Lucius Siccius, who was appointed to quell the uprisings in Judea, was tasked with suppressing these rebellions. Siccius, known for his harsh methods, conducted a series of military campaigns to break the back of the Jewish resistance. One of the most significant actions he took was the execution of several prominent Jewish leaders, including Julian and Pappus. Their deaths marked a turning point in the rebellion, as it sent a clear message to the Jewish population about the extent of Roman retribution for resisting imperial rule. Despite these efforts to suppress the Jewish revolt, the situation in Judea remained unstable. The executions of Julian and Pappus did not signal the end of Jewish resistance, Rather, they fueled further resentment and hatred towards the Roman occupiers. The Jewish community, particularly the Zealot factions that had previously been active in the Great Revolt of 66-73 CE, saw these events as yet another example of Roman brutality and tyranny. The deaths of their leaders became a rallying cry for continued resistance, as many Jews believed that their fight for independence was not yet over. In the broader context of Roman policy, Hadrian's approach to Judea was shaped by a desire to stabilize the region without the unnecessary escalation of conflict. In this regard, Hadrian's strategies were far more diplomatic than his predecessor Trajan's, who had been focused on military conquest. While Trajan had led Rome to expand its borders to their furthest reaches, including in the east, Hadrian sought to consolidate power and avoid the destabilizing effects of further territorial expansion. This shift in priorities led to a significant change in Roman policy in Judea. Hadrian made the difficult decision to abandon some of the territories that had been conquered under Trajan, including Mesopotamia, focusing instead on securing the frontiers and stabilizing internal unrest. In Judea, Hadrian's efforts to stabilize the region involved military suppression, but also an attempt to integrate the Jewish population more fully into the Roman Empire, though this would ultimately lead to further unrest. Hadrian's decision to impose a new level of control over the Jewish population was viewed with deep suspicion by the local community. Among his actions was the establishment of Roman colonies and the introduction of Roman law, further tightening Roman control. Additionally, Hadrian's decision to rebuild Jerusalem as a Roman city, renaming it Aelia Capitolina, enraged the Jewish population. This new city was intended to symbolize Roman dominance, and the rebuilding of the Temple Mount into a pagan shrine was seen as a deliberate affront to Jewish religious sensibilities. As tensions continued to mount in Judea, it became evident that Hadrian's attempts at pacification were insufficient to quell the resentment boiling among the Jewish population. Despite the executions of Julian, Pappus, and other rebel leaders, the pressure from Jewish resistance groups remained high, and this persistent defiance would ultimately lead to the outbreak of the Bar Kokhba Revolt in 132 CE. This conflict would be far more destructive than any of the uprisings that preceded it, with the Roman Empire deploying a vast military force to crush the resistance once and for all. Hadrian's control over Judea, marked by the execution of rebel leaders and attempts at forced assimilation, was a precursor to the even greater tragedy that would unfold in the region. The Jewish revolt had long been a thorn in the side of Roman power in Judea, and Hadrian's efforts to suppress it would only deepen the animosity between the two sides. The conflict, fueled by both Roman repression and Jewish resistance, would eventually lead to one of the most brutal chapters in Roman-Jewish relations. In the end, the transition from Trajan's expansionist reign to Hadrian's more conservative policies did not provide a lasting peace in Judea. Instead, Hadrian's focus on control and suppression, exemplified by the executions of Jewish leaders and the imposition of Roman laws, set the stage for further conflict. The seeds of the Bar Kokhba Revolt had already been sown, and it would take only a few more years for the region to erupt once again in rebellion, ultimately leading to even greater devastation for the Jewish people and further entrenching Roman power in the region. Hadrian's reign was marked by a desire for stability, yet his decisions regarding Judea had profound and far-reaching consequences that would reshape the region for generations. His policy of consolidation, which involved the abandonment of certain territorial conquests, was an attempt to stabilize the Roman Empire's vast borders. However, his actions in Judea, specifically his treatment of the Jewish population, only fueled resentment and laid the groundwork for further conflict. Hadrian's controversial decisions in 130 CE, particularly the rebuilding of Jerusalem as Aelia Capitolina and the imposition of harsh restrictions on the Jewish people ignited tensions that ultimately led to the catastrophic Bar Kokhba Revolt in 132 CE. One of Hadrian's most contentious decisions was the reconstruction of Jerusalem. After the devastation of the city during the Jewish War 6673 CE and the subsequent suppression of the rebellion, Jerusalem had been left in ruins. Hadrian, seeking to establish Roman dominance in the region, decided to rebuild the city not as a Jewish capital, but as a Roman one. He renamed it Aelia Capitolina in honor of himself and Jupiter, the chief Roman god, and constructed a Roman temple dedicated to Jupiter on the site of the Jewish temple. This act of rebuilding was perceived by the Jewish population as a deliberate affront to their religious and cultural identity. The site of the Second Temple, which had been destroyed by the Romans in 70 CE, held immense significance for the Jewish people, and the establishment of a pagan temple in its place was seen as an act of desecration. Hadrian also implemented a series of restrictions that further exacerbated the tension between the Roman authorities and the Jewish people. One of the most significant of these measures was the prohibition of Jewish religious practices, including circumcision and the observance of certain festivals. Hadrian's aim was to suppress Jewish identity and force them to assimilate into Roman culture, but these actions only deepened the sense of alienation and oppression among the Jewish population. The combination of these policies, alongside the reconstruction of Jerusalem as a Roman city, created an atmosphere of widespread discontent. In response to Hadrian's oppressive policies, a charismatic leader emerged among the Jewish rebels, Simon Bar Kokhba. Bar Kokhba, whose name means son of the star, was hailed by many as the Jewish Messiah, a figure destined to restore Jewish sovereignty and independence. He led a powerful revolt against the Roman Empire, rallying support from a large segment of the Jewish population who were eager to reclaim their land and religion from Roman domination. The Bar Kokhba Revolt, which began in 132 CE, was one of the most significant and devastating uprisings in Jewish history. The revolt initially gained substantial momentum, as Jewish forces, led by Bar Kokhba, seized key territories in Judea and inflicted significant losses on Roman garrisons. The Jewish rebels, emboldened by their early victories, established an independent state in Judea, and Bar Kokhba was recognized as the leader of this new entity. However, the revolt was met with overwhelming Roman force. Hadrian, determined to suppress the rebellion and maintain Roman control, sent his best generals and a massive military force to Judea. The Romans, under the leadership of generals such as Julius Severus, systematically crushed the Jewish resistance, employing brutal tactics to secure victory. Despite their initial successes, the Jewish rebels were no match for the sheer size and strength of the Roman military. The Roman forces eventually encircled and besieged the fortified strongholds of the rebels. The most notable of these strongholds was Masada, a symbol of Jewish resistance from the earlier Jewish revolt, where the final remnants of Bar Kokhba's forces made their last stand. This siege lasted for years, but eventually the Roman military broke through the defenses and destroyed the final pockets of resistance. The brutality of the Roman response to the Bar Kokhba revolt was staggering. According to historical accounts, hundreds of thousands of Jews were killed, and many more were enslaved or forced into exile. The fall of the Bar Kokhba revolt marked the end of Jewish sovereignty in Judea for centuries. Hadrian's response to the rebellion was swift and unforgiving. The Roman Empire crushed the Jewish resistance, but the cost was high. The destruction and death toll were immense, and the aftermath of the revolt had lasting repercussions on the Jewish people. Hadrian imposed even more severe restrictions on the Jews, including a ban on entering Jerusalem except for 1 day a year, which further humiliated and marginalized the Jewish community. Hadrian's actions in Judea, particularly his decision to rebuild Jerusalem as Aelia Capitolina and his attempts to erase Jewish cultural identity, set the stage for the Bar Kokhba revolt. His harsh policies, combined with the long-standing tensions between the Roman Empire and the Jewish people, created a powder keg that eventually exploded into open rebellion. The Bar Kokhba Revolt became a symbol of Jewish resistance against Roman oppression, but it also marked the end of any hope for an independent Jewish state in the region for centuries to come. The revolt's brutal suppression left a deep scar on the Jewish community, and the consequences of Hadrian's decisions would be felt for generations, shaping the future of Judea and the Jewish people in the Roman world. The Bar Kokhba Revolt, ignited by the oppressive policies of Emperor Hadrian and his efforts to erase Jewish cultural identity, initially caught the Roman Empire off guard due to the unexpected resilience and strategic brilliance of the Jewish rebels. Simon Bar Kokhba, the charismatic leader hailed as the Messiah, led his forces with remarkable success. Using guerrilla tactics that capitalized on the difficult terrain of Judea, his forces launched surprise attacks, ambushed Roman patrols, and seized key strongholds, including forts and Roman garrisons scattered across the region. This decentralized form of warfare, based on mobility, ambushes, and the exploitation of the landscape, allowed the rebels to inflict significant casualties on the Roman forces. Despite their numerical disadvantage, one of the most striking aspects of Bar Kokhba's leadership was his ability to establish a quasi-independent Jewish state in Judea. For over 2 years, Bar Kokhba governed this newly formed state, issuing decrees, organizing defense, and leading the rebellion with a sense of purpose and authority. His rule was not limited to military victories, but extended into governance, as he established a functioning society within the territories under his control. Jewish communities in Judea, once subjugated by Roman imperialism, now found themselves living under a ruler who sought to restore their independence and religious practices. The revolt even witnessed the minting of Jewish coins, a significant symbol of sovereignty and resistance. These coins, bearing Bar Kokhba's name and Jewish symbols, were a declaration of defiance against Roman rule and a powerful assertion of the Jews' desire for independence. Bar Kokhba's leadership also gained significant support from Jewish religious leaders, who viewed him as the fulfillment of the messianic prophecy. Prominent rabbis of the time, including Rabbi Akiva, declared Bar Kokhba to be the son of the star, a messianic figure prophesied to restore Israel. This spiritual backing provided Bar Kokhba with legitimacy, motivating many Jews to join the cause and contributing to the early successes of the revolt. However, as with all uprisings against the Roman Empire, the tide soon turned. Despite the early successes, the Roman response was swift and overwhelming. Hadrian, unwilling to allow another Jewish rebellion to challenge Roman authority, dispatched an enormous force to quash the revolt. The Roman military, under the command of Julius Severus, systematically dismantled the rebel strongholds and launched brutal counteroffensives that ultimately overwhelmed the Jewish forces. The rebellion, once a symbol of Jewish hope for independence, was soon reduced to desperate resistance in isolated pockets. The Roman victory in 135 CE marked the tragic end of the Bar Kokhba Revolt and sealed the fate of Judea. After years of guerrilla warfare and defiant resistance, the Jewish forces, led by Bar Kokhba, finally succumbed to the overwhelming power of Rome. The pivotal moment came with the fall of the stronghold at Bedtime, the last major rebel base. The siege, which lasted for months, ended in the capture of Bar Kokhba's forces. The brutal Roman assault, led by General C.S. Julius Severus, crushed the remaining pockets of resistance, and the once hopeful revolt was extinguished. The aftermath of the revolt was catastrophic for the Jewish population. The Roman military conducted a ruthless campaign of retribution, leaving Judea devastated. The region was ravaged by widespread destruction, with entire villages and towns reduced to rubble. Thousands of Jews who had participated in the revolt or had been caught in the conflict were either killed or enslaved, contributing to the significant loss of life and the forced displacement of Jewish communities. The Romans did not stop at military victory. They sought to erase the very identity of Judea, leaving a lasting scar on the Jewish people. In an effort to completely quash any lingering sense of Jewish independence, Hadrian implemented policies designed to sever the connection between the Jews and their ancestral homeland. Judea was officially renamed Syria Palestina, a move intended to obscure its Jewish identity and suppress any future rebellion. This renaming was a symbolic act of conquest, furthering Rome's efforts to erase Jewish culture and history from the region. Along with the renaming, Jews were banned from entering Jerusalem, except on the day of Tisha B'Av, marking a final blow to their connection to the city. The scale of the destruction was unparalleled, with an estimated 500,000 Jews perishing during the revolt and its aftermath. The Jewish diaspora grew even more widespread, as many survivors were forcibly exiled to other parts of the Roman Empire. In the wake of the revolt, Judea was left in ruins, its once thriving population decimated. The Bar Kokhba Revolt thus ended not only with military defeat, but also with a cultural and demographic upheaval that would resonate throughout Jewish history for centuries to come. Following the catastrophic Roman victory in 135 CE and the destruction of Bedtime, the changes in Judea were profound and lasting. The Jewish population had been decimated, and the region was forever altered by Roman policies of suppression and repopulation. With the fall of the Bar Kokhba Revolt, Judea witnessed massive depopulation, as the majority of the Jewish inhabitants were either killed, enslaved, or exiled to far-flung corners of the Roman Empire. In a calculated effort to reassert Roman control and diminish the Jewish presence in the region, Hadrian and the Roman authorities repopulated the area with veterans, immigrants from neighboring provinces, and settlers from various parts of the empire. Jewish villages, once the heart of the region, were systematically depopulated. The lands that had once been owned and worked by Jewish families were confiscated by the Roman authorities and repurposed for Roman estates and Christian monasteries. This transformation marked a clear shift in the demographic and cultural landscape of Judea, as the Roman presence grew more pronounced. The Romanization of the region was evident, with Roman customs, infrastructure, and military presence becoming a dominant force in everyday life. The enslavement of Jews became widespread, and many survivors were sold into slavery across the Roman Empire. This mass enslavement contributed significantly to the Jewish diaspora, scattering Jewish communities far and wide, making it harder for them to maintain any hope of reclaiming their homeland. Families were torn apart, and Jewish identity was further suppressed as Roman dominance extended its reach. On top of these demographic and economic changes, Hadrian imposed a series of religious decrees aimed at extinguishing Jewish cultural and religious practices. Torah law was banned, and the Hebrew calendar was outlawed, making it impossible for Jews to maintain their religious observances. Sacred Jewish scrolls, which held deep cultural and spiritual significance, were ceremonially burned in a public display of Roman power, and to ensure the eradication of Jewish traditions. Hadrian's policies served not only as a punishment for the revolt, but as an ongoing effort to erase Jewish identity from the region, further deepening the divide between the Jewish people and their once vibrant homeland. These post-revolt changes left a scar on Jewish history that would endure for generations, as the scars of Roman oppression remained deeply embedded in the collective memory of the Jewish people. The aftermath of the Bar Kokhba Revolt saw the Roman Empire implement a series of harsh measures that would forever reshape the landscape of Judea and the Jewish identity. In a decisive move, Hadrian renamed the province from Judea to Syria Palestina, a symbolic act aimed at severing the deep-rooted connection between the Jewish people and their ancestral homeland. This renaming was not just a geographical change. It was a calculated attempt to erase the very memory of Judea as the land of the Jewish people, turning it into an indistinguishable part of the Roman Empire. The historical and cultural significance of Judea was intentionally obscured, marking a pivotal moment in Roman efforts to suppress Jewish nationalism. In addition to the renaming of the province, Hadrian instituted further measures to curtail Jewish identity. Jews were forbidden to enter the newly established Roman colony of Aelia Capitolina, except on the day of Tisha B'Av, the day of mourning for the destruction of the first and second temples. By restricting access to Jerusalem and the sacred land, the Roman authorities sought to obliterate any remnants of Jewish connection to the city, where their spiritual and historical ties ran deep. The very heart of Jewish religious life and memory was placed under Roman control, with no room for the Jewish people to return or to live freely within their own land. These efforts were not merely punitive. They were part of a broader strategy to erase Jewish identity and culture, leaving a lasting imprint on Roman-Jewish relations. The measures imposed after the Bar Kokhba Revolt, including the suppression of Jewish practices, the destruction of sacred texts, and the forced relocation of Jewish populations, had long-term consequences. For generations, the Jewish people would live in exile, separated from their homeland, carrying with them the scars of Roman oppression. The end of the Bar Kokhba Revolt marked not just the collapse of the Jewish resistance, but the beginning of a new chapter in Roman domination. The Jewish people, scattered across the empire, would struggle to maintain their identity in a world that sought to erase their past. Yet, despite these efforts, the spirit of the Jewish people endured. Though their homeland was taken from them, their culture, traditions, and resilience would eventually lay the groundwork for their return to Judea many centuries later.